Hey everybody, welcome back to World History. This is our last section of notes for the fall semester. We will be doing Chapter 8, Section 4 and 5 today. When you are finished, your notes will be due. So go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started for the time this semester. So, medieval universities emerged. As economic and political conditions improved, the need for education grew. And the church began to educate the clergy, and the government wanted literate officials, so it allowed for the establishment of a lot of these universities, um, mainly in places like cathedrals. They specialized in specific courses of study, and you traveled for the subject you wanted to study. You'd go to Salerno, Italy, if you wanted to go into medicine, Bologna, Italy, to become a lawyer, Paris to study art, medicine, law, and theology, and Oxford in England to study religious and political study. Educational lifestyle, it was a pretty rigorous lifestyle. You had prayer at 5 o'clock in the morning. Classes started early, and your first meal would be at 10 a.m. You'd have afternoon classes till 5 p.m. You could then eat dinner and then study till bedtime. You sat on hard benches for hours, and you were expected to remember what they heard every single day. So when it came down to it, there were different areas of study. There were the 7 liberal arts, things like arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And there were separate programs for things like law and medicine and theology. So women in education were not allowed to attend the universities. Women were educated at convents. A great example is Christine de Pizan, who is considered to be almost the first feminist in human history. She worked to promote women at the Notre Dame de Paris, where she worked. Now, Europeans also began to acquire new learning styles, bringing in stuff from ancient Greece and the Muslim empires, and the advanced knowledge with Muslim translations into Latin used by Western Europe. A lot of the ancient world's ideas were really starting to come back into play again after they had gone away during the Dark Ages that we talked about last chapter. New ideas. There was a new challenge to current religious beliefs, and Aristotle's ideas came back. And mainly his idea to the reason to discover the truth. And the church would go on to say, well, we have our faith, and that is the final authority on the matter. Saying anything against this would be against the church. Of scholasticism, a method that used reason to support Christian beliefs. Philosopher Thomas Aquinas said summa theologica, or faith and reason, exist in harmony, and that their truth was that God rules over an orderly universe. And it combined the Christian faith with classical Greek philosophy, making it so that people would still have the ability to study science, but it wouldn't go against what they believed. Some more in science and math. A lot of that back. That being said, there was very little progress in science. The ideas of Aristotle and Hippocrates came back. In mathematics, Euclid and some Hindu-Arabic numerals came back, and they contributed to some advances, but it was very slow going. In terms of literature, there was a lot of literature being written during this period using a specific type of vernacular or the everyday language of ordinary people. It wasn't all written in Latin. You have things like the Song of Roland, who talks about the knight of Charlemagne, who was a hero, loyal, and who sacrificed their life. The poem of the Cid by Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, who refers to the Christian Lord as Cid and describes the fight with and versus the Muslims. You also have the Divine Comedy written by Dante Alighieri, a Italian poet, and the quest for religious understanding. It summarizes Christian ethics actually really well, and that actions determine your fate in the Christian belief system. I also have Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, medieval society. And it was shared by a band of pilgrims traveling to St. Thomas Becket's tomb, with a number of characters, including the knight, the plowman, the merchant, miller, monk, and the nun. There's a bunch of different stories that fall into Canterbury Tales. In terms of architecture and art, there was a lot of trade and wealth, and these cathedrals became a symbol of wealth and devotion as well. They really started to embrace a more fortresses with thick walls, towers, smaller no windows, and they were very dark and gloomy places. But on the flip side, you have the Gothic style. Yep. And their flying buttresses or stone supports that stood outside the church, higher, thinner walls, stonemasons that would then depict scenes from the Bible, the lives of saints, plants and animals, mythical creatures. And this the illiterate, because most stained glass windows at this point in history told a story. Paintings, manuscripts, and tapestries. Altar pieces were a huge thing. They symbolized religious ideas, and religious figures would then inspire devotion. Books, illumination or artistic decoration of books really started. Biblical scenes, daily life, brilliant colors, and detailed artist pieces were used to really show people what everyday life was like. Tapestries, essentially paintings made out of thread. They added color and warmth to castles. The Bayeux tapestry is a great example of this. And that's it for section 4, so we're just going to keep on going into section 5. A time of crisis. The 13 Well, I need my screen to catch up. There we go. In the 1300s, there was a massive crop failure, which led to a huge famine. Throw on top of it the plague, a war, and essentially you have the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern age. So let's start with the plague. So it started out of the port of Kaffa, and it broke out in China. The bubonic plague, specifically, was spread by fleas and carried by rats, and it caused an epidemic, or an outbreak of a rapid spreading disease. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population, which historians have estimated to be about 25 million people. The extent of areas by 1353, so literally 6 years later, all the purple had had the plague. So normal life completely broke down during the plague. It brought terror and confusion. There was no known cure or prevention. Some people turned to magic and witchcraft for cures. Some saw it as God's punishment. Most left the cities. Some hid in their homes. Some blamed Jewish people for the plague. And death and social unrest massively expanded and were everywhere during this period. And as a result, the economy suffered. A third of your workforce gets sick and dies, you've lost a lot of labor. There was also a demand for higher wages as well, and the cost of labor rose, and which, by extension, caused inflation or the rising of prices. Guilds stopped accepting new members, and landowners and merchants were pushed for laws to limit wages. This led to peasant revolts all across Europe. Even the church wasn't immune to the issues. There were spiritual crises, scandal, and division. The church literally split due to weak leaders. Pope Clement V moved the church court to southern France in Avignon. There was a lot of criticism and that he was very worldly and pleasure-loving, loved all of his stuff. And reformers elected their own new leader in Rome, which caused a schism, which elect a new Pope, Martin V, and reunify the church, but that would take some time. So, respond speak out more against the church. John Wycliffe being one of the biggest ones. He was an Oxford professor. He attacked the church's corruption and stated that the Bible, not the church, was the source of the English. You also have people like Jan Hus, who led a number of reforms as well. Their response: they were well, looks like we're back online. Sorry if there was an interruption in the video. Uh, so a series of conflicts in the Hundred Years' War, it boiled down to being France versus England. Their nationalism and pride in one's nation, their economic rivalry, and wanting land just led to a lot of fighting. English kings had claimed that French land, mainly places like Brittany, Normandy, Flanders, and Burgundy, actually belonged to Britain when they didn't. It led to 100 years of conflict, and especially the English Channel was a major place of these battles. So the English won a lot of early victories at places like Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, and utilizing things like the longbow, which was a powerful 6-foot long bow used by archers. They could pierce all but the heaviest of armor, and you could fire 3 arrows versus 1 by crossbow. The French response: they started using cannons to smash castle walls. And of course, it would be remiss if when we talked about the Hundred Years' War, if we didn't talk about Joan of Arc. She was a 17-year-old peasant girl in France and claimed that she was sent by God to save France. She inspired a lot of French victories until she was captured by the British. She was burned at the stake for being a witch, which rallied the French forces, and eventually Joan of Arc was actually declared a saint. So some results. The French kings massively expand their power, and then, of course, the cannon. England, on the other hand, is kind of 50-50 as to what they got. And Parliament did gain power, but they lost lands to France. They also gained new overseas trade, and they also had the longbow. But so some impact showed that that a lot of the European countries had a need for larger armies. They started to hire soldiers. The population started to expand again. Manufacturing grew. There was an increase in trade. And Italian cities began to flourish as trading centers, and borrowed and developed new technologies allowed for the rise of the Renaissance, which we'll talk more about next semester. So thanks for sticking with me this semester. I hope you all had fun. I'll see you all in January. Bye, everyone.